Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon to those of you joining from Europe. My name is Paul Fenton. I'm the President and CEO of Montrium. And today we're going to be talking about the future of computing and the future being cloud. So the future is cloud. We're going to be talking about how we can leverage Microsoft's cloud, so Azure this morning, and how we can actually qualify it for regulated applications within the life sciences. The goal of our webinar this morning is really to be able to present you with an overview of the various different steps that you would follow to qualify the Azure environment. And we'll also be giving you a little bit of insight into how Azure works, the various different pieces of Azure, and also insight into where the industry is going with cloud computing as well. The slide deck will be distributed upon request. You just need to reach out to us and request those slides. And as I said, we'll also be providing a recording. At the end of the webinar, we'll also open up to the audience for questions, and there's a question panel in your GoToWebinar application there. So if you can just write the questions in there, and then we'll read them out and provide you with answers. The presenters this morning, there are 3 of us presenting this morning. So first of all, I'd like to welcome Gabor Fari, who's the Director of Business Development and Strategy for Health and Life Sciences at Microsoft. And Gabor has a wealth of knowledge around not only the cloud offering from Microsoft, but also the needs of the life sciences when it comes to computing and infrastructure. I'll be presenting this morning. I'll be giving you an oversight of where the industry is at the moment. And then finally, my colleague Michael Zwedkar, who's the Vice President of Operations at Montrium, will be giving you a practical step-by-step overview. The agenda, so we'll start with the Microsoft Cloud Story and Vision, which will be presented by Gabor. I'll then give an introduction to the regulated cloud and what it means, and also the new paradigm that we're having to deal with when it comes to cloud qualification. We'll also be looking at some of the opportunities for industry once we're able to actually adopt the cloud. And at that point, I'll hand things over to my colleague Michael, who will then go over the proposed qualification approach, the step-by-step overview of how we actually go about qualifying Azure, and then he'll also provide a conclusion and some recommendations. At that point, we'll open it up to Q&A. So with that, I'm going to hand things over to my colleague Gabor, who will be presenting the Microsoft Cloud Story and Vision.
Good morning and good afternoon, anyone who can hear me, and hopefully everything, my screen is projecting. So I'd like to welcome again and thank you for the opportunity to co-present with our friends at Montrium. I'm very happy to have the opportunity to talk a little bit about Microsoft's Cloud Story and Vision. When we look at the cloud, it really is changing the IT conversation. Historically, when we look at the economics of the cloud, due to its massive scale, keeps on dropping the price of compute and storage. So clearly, over the years, the cost of cloud computing has dropped rapidly. At the same time, when we look at the agility and that it affords IT, it's been going up, perhaps not as dramatically, but the most important thing with cloud computing, it can actually level off the amount of computing that's available. So as companies have moved towards implementing cloud technology, even within their own data centers, they have reached the plateau, and in many companies who have more compute needs than their existing data centers can afford, cloud computing has allowed them to offload some of those workloads to the cloud. So forecasting demand for computing and actually running your data center at peak efficiency is almost impossible to do because your demands change, and the reality is that real estate is is a limited resource. So when cloud computing started to take off, the most important one was a factor was that companies started to offload their workloads to the cloud. But what does it take to build the cloud? Microsoft is one of very few companies who can actually achieve cloud computing at scale. We are now deploying our 4th generation of data centers. Some of these data centers could have 1 million servers. So that is actually 6 zeros. And all the Microsoft data centers are actually located next to the main pipes of the internet, which is also another capability that very few cloud providers can achieve. So with global scalability, global redundancy, and the ability to meet rapidly changing global demand, we're the first cloud vendor to actually have the ability to co-locate a data center right in China. We just announced and opened up the first one in Brazil, and we're still massively ramping up. So what drives the Microsoft Cloud is what's called the Global Foundation Services, and over the years we've rapidly expanded the technology to dramatically lower the cost of cloud computing to the point where the computers are just loaded in pods and running in data centers. We don't even build massive air-conditioned buildings anymore. So cloud computing is rapidly becoming a commodity. So when you look at the end-to-end solution platform that we're doing with the cloud, the reality is that we are driving cloud computing and cloud first for everything we do. All the traditional Microsoft products that people have known, in this particular case SharePoint, but other that we are going to be talking about mostly with Montrium, but other Microsoft products as well, such as Microsoft CRM and even our database services, it's all being architected and delivered with a cloud first mindset. So we will look at the traditional value chain in life sciences, from R&D, manufacturing, sales, and marketing that ties together employees, customers, and partners. All of this is being delivered in the cloud. All this is being delivered with a mobile-first mindset. All of this is being delivered with social computing integrated as part of the overall fabric, and that rests on the Microsoft Cloud platform that delivers analytics and business intelligence, workflow and guided processes, business rules and logic, as well as a flexible metadata schema that is available both on cloud and on premise. And coupled with this, to really make cloud work, what else do you need? You need the ability to drive configuration extensibility, data and process integration. Of course, everything has to be driven by security and identity management, and having a common management platform that can manage your workloads all the way from on-premise to the cloud to hybrid cloud scenarios. So the vision for Microsoft is to deliver all of this in a single, seamlessly integrated package. And again, I believe that we are one of the very few vendors who actually have this holistic vision from the cloud to the data center and with a common set of management tools. So this cloud vision really leads to anywhere, any device access for enterprise class productivity. So both our Office 365 and Microsoft Azure platforms, which is the focus on of the webinar today, can tie together PCs, phones, browsers, tablets with all 3 main operating systems, and to integrate calendaring, email, contacts, tasks, the directory management, as well as offline access. Some of you who are in attendance may have heard that we've just released the Office for the iPad application. So we're rapidly moving to be device agnostic in terms of actually being able to put our cloud services and productivity tools behind all the devices that people use, and with the ability to manage them together. When we move on, what are the main principles of the cloud? And I've referred to this earlier. The principles are to maintain an evergreen service, to provide a platform built on security, privacy, and trust, and offer a highly configurable and scalable set of services. When you are selecting a cloud platform and a cloud vendor, there are a few considerations that you really should look at. And the traditional considerations that people have highlighted would be definitely what the capabilities are to be able to cover all the major cloud scenarios, which is infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, software as a service, and hybrid scenarios. Again, the Azure platform actually is the only platform that covers all of these main scenarios. Of course, there's the cost, and there's the rapidly declining cost as the scale goes up. Microsoft has announced that we will match Amazon's price cuts, and we have actually followed through with that almost to the day that the price cuts have been announced. So today, the cost of running a cloud workload is a fraction of what it was even 2 years ago. And of course, there's performance, SLAs, as well as scale. I've mentioned integrated management tools, but most importantly, I wanted to leave the last one where I think is a real key differentiator when you're looking at cloud services is trust. And the question that I would encourage everyone to ask themselves is, whose cloud can you trust? So how safe is the cloud from data breaches? Can you encrypt the data, whether it's at rest or in flight? Do you have integrated security keys that allows you to manage the security keys even on your own premise while you're running the workload on the cloud? And can you trust your cloud to become online if there's any catastrophic event at any data center? These are really the questions you got to trust. There's a lot of companies that are touting that they're cloud first, but they're really missing the rest of the decision factors that I've actually listed above. So when we look at the compliance capabilities, clearly we are pushing very hard for GxP compliance. This is a Montrium webinar, and we have actually jointly authored a set of white papers about GxP compliance and the cloud qualification white papers. But the foundation of this is all the other main compliance capabilities that we already meet and we've met for a long time. So when you look at some of the key capabilities that people look for, whether it's SOC 1 Type 11 or ISO 20001 or the EU model clause or HIPAA to be able to sign a BAA agreement, Microsoft has been doing all of this for years, and clearly compliance is a key differentiator for us. And if you, at the conclusion of this webinar, I would invite everyone to visit the Microsoft Azure web pages and to visit the Trust Center, where we have all the documentation that actually shows all of the compliance we have. We undergo security and compliance audits on a regular basis by the best known audit companies, and we have annual updates to the Trust Center documentation to show people that this is really a trustworthy computing environment. And some of you may remember the trustworthy computing environment that we have started 10 years ago. We have now extended that to the cloud with the Azure platform as well. So thank you again, and over to you, Paul.
Thank you, Gabor. So that's great. So I'm now going to move on a little bit and get more specific with regards to the pharmaceutical industry. And so, first of all, I'd like to really sort of just introduce a little bit. What does the regulated cloud mean to us as an industry? I think, first of all, it's very clear that there are many different factors that are pushing the pharma industry today to adopt new strategies for computerized systems. I think obviously the first factor is that new technology is available to us, and we need to embrace it. It's very clear that IT is going towards cloud, and then maybe in 10 years' time, everything will be cloud. And so we have to move in that direction. But there are also other factors, notably factors in relation to the global nature of our business and the fact that we're actually conducting operations really on a global scale. And this can be quite challenging with traditional IT infrastructures. I think another factor that's really pushing the use of cloud is the necessity really to create economies of scale obviously we're faced now with a very different era with the patent cliff and less money available really to do research and development and even marketing activities around our products. And therefore we have to be more lean and more agile in our approach to our activities and operations. At the same time, we of course still need to maintain a very high level of quality, and we need to maintain compliance. And this is really key, and this is where there can be a certain challenge because of our traditional model that we're really still in. And with cloud computing, we're really talking about a new paradigm, a new way of doing things, and a new way of conceiving things even. And that's really what is extremely challenging for most of the pharmaceutical companies that we speak with on this subject. The cloud, of course, does promise a lot. As Gabor said, it's cheaper. It can be a lot faster when it comes to deploying applications because we're really in a virtualized environment. It's much more scalable. We really use what we need when we need it. There's high availability because of the infrastructure that the cloud vendors have put in place and sort of geo redundancy. And of course, we have better disaster recovery capacity as well. And this is always a really important area for consideration when we're running regulated applications. One of our problems is that we actually don't have any clear regulatory guidance, not yet anyway. There's definitely a lot of discussion around how we meet the existing regulations whilst deploying applications on the cloud. And if we look at things like 21 CFR Part 11, I mean, that dates from the late 90s and was last revised in 2003. And so, technology has definitely moved on. Unfortunately, the regulations haven't yet moved on, but there's definitely a sense of urgency with the regulators, and there's of course other initiatives ongoing with ISPE and the GAMP model, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. I think the biggest factor that we're facing is this dilemma that we always tend to face in the life sciences, and that's innovation versus compliance. And how can we innovate while still continuing to meet the regulatory requirements? Some of those challenges, I think the first compliance challenge that we have is that we've typically been conservative and very risk averse in the pharma industry when it comes to computerized systems compliance, and that's something that we have to get past, and hopefully new regulation could help us do that. Also, when it comes to pharma, there's very specific requirements around quality and compliance and the different controls that we have to have in place. And we need to remember that cloud providers typically go across all industries. They're not specific to our industry, and therefore the controls that they have may not necessarily be exactly the same as those we're typically used to seeing within a pharma environment. We've also traditionally focused qualification around individual machines and very specific hardware and software. With the cloud, that changes. It's no longer the case. We need to look at the cloud as if it was one machine that was qualified, and I think that's a concept that can be quite challenging. The other thing that we also need to do is we need to be able to clearly identify and document all of our system components. In Europe, with the Annex 11, it says that we have to have a system description which clearly describes all of the system components, including the hardware and the software. When it comes to cloud, that can be quite challenging, but there are ways and means to address that. Another area of challenge is ownership, and it's sometimes unclear who's responsible for what, and that's something that we really have to clearly define. And then finally, by its very nature, cloud computing is subject to updates which are not necessarily in our control. And so we need to be able to adapt to that. And so our change control processes will be slightly different if we're actually using a cloud type environment. And that's something that we also need to address. So the cloud qualification paradigm, really, as I mentioned earlier, we need to visualize a vendor's cloud as one single environment. And we need to clearly make a distinction in terms of roles and responsibilities between what the vendor is responsible for doing and what the sponsor or client is responsible for doing. One thing that we really should do as we're rolling out a cloud environment for regulated applications is to map the vendor controls, which may not be exactly as we're used to seeing them, to the typical controls that we should have in place to be able to meet 21 CFR Part 11, Annex 11, and any other regulation that deals with computerized systems that we need to be compliant with. We also need to perform and document due diligence in some form to ensure compliance. There's definitely an expectation from the regulators that due diligence is done if we're going to be delegating certain responsibilities to a vendor. And so that's something that we also need to think carefully about. How do we actually do that due diligence? How do we actually document it? And that's really where the qualification guideline that was written last year comes in to give you advice and guidance in how to actually put that due diligence in place. And then finally, we also need to have specific processes which are adapted to the cloud to ensure that we're able to continuously ensure the qualified and validated state of our regulated applications that are running on that cloud environment. Now, earlier I mentioned ISPE and the GAMP framework. There was a special interest group established by GAMP in 2012, and this is very encouraging because obviously GAMP is really considered a gold standard when it comes to computerized systems within GXP environments and how we actually go about documenting, qualifying, validating, and maintaining those systems. And so the fact that GAMP has taken this on is excellent. And what GAMP has done is they've actually reached out to FDA, they've reached out also to a subset of pharma companies and also cloud providers, really to bring them all together to collaborate on the subject of how do we achieve a compliant cloud. And the goal is really to put together a framework very similar to what we see in GAMP 5, which will satisfy the needs of the regulators, the sponsors, and the cloud service providers. So it really will give us a formal framework to work with when we're trying to use cloud for regulated applications. The framework would be based on our existing best practices, and really there won't be that much difference between a traditional on-premise versus cloud-based environment, but there are some differences, small differences. And so they'll already take all of the good work that's been done up until now with the GAMP series up to GAMP 5, and then adapt that to be able to meet the requirements of the new cloud paradigm and cloud infrastructure. To summarize and finish up, before I hand things over to Michael, who will be taking us through some very practical examples, I think there are many different opportunities for industry if they adopt cloud computing. And I just wanted to highlight some of those. I think the first one, which is a very important one, is the reduced time and cost that it takes to implement GXP applications. This traditionally has been an area which is very difficult to manage. So trying to keep these types of projects on budget and trying to get these things in place in a very expedited fashion has always been very, very challenging. But I think that the cloud computing and the virtualized nature of cloud computing will change that. We also, of course, will have better performance, redundancy, and lower cost. We get significant scalability with the cloud, something that wasn't always easy when we were dealing with our own data centers. And of course, with a cloud like Azure, we have a significant amount of redundancy on a global scale. And so that really puts us in a very good position for deploying sort of high availability applications. We also will be able to focus on our core business. Our core business is discovering, developing drugs and medical devices and manufacturing and selling those drugs and medical devices. It's not running data centers, and so by adopting a cloud strategy, we can actually reduce the burden, that IT burden, of actually maintaining all of that infrastructure, and that's significant. Also, we get much better geographical distribution. Our users can be much closer to their applications because of the geo-redundant nature of the Azure cloud. And then finally, the cloud really has a lot of promise in terms of the way that the applications that we typically use in GXP environments are going to evolve. We're going to see a lot more software as a service, pay-per-use type applications, and really, a lot of scalability and also much better integration between those applications as the cloud environment and the application pool evolves. So with that, I'm going to pass things over to my colleague Michael, who will be giving you a practical overview of the guideline that was put in place last year in collaboration with Microsoft for qualifying Azure.
Great. Thanks very much, Paul. So now that we've seen what Microsoft's vision is for the cloud, as presented by Gabor, and how leveraging the cloud technology could have a significant positive impact on the regulated life sciences industry, as Paul mentioned, I'm going to cover some of the more specific and practical aspects, which include a proposed qualification and compliance assessment methodology, an overview of the Azure qualification process, the various steps that we'll go through in order to actually qualify a GXP application that's going to be put into the Azure platform, and general considerations and recommendations for customers who are wishing to use Azure in the context of GXP regulated activities. So as was already mentioned, we've put together a qualification guideline. So I'll be presenting key concepts that were described in detail within this guideline, which was published last year and which is available for download from our website. So we recognize that increasingly customers within the life sciences industry are looking to leverage the benefits of the cloud. However, there are several concerns that are specific to the industry, and so we worked together with Microsoft to create this qualification guideline in order to address these concerns. So the following are key questions that we wanted to address when producing the guideline. So what is the impact on compliance when considering the shift of control over processes governing infrastructure? For example, security, change management. Which controls need to be in place in order to meet the regulatory requirements? And what are the responsibilities of the cloud vendor? So in this case, that would be Microsoft versus those of the customer. And what needs to be verified when performing qualification in the context of a cloud environment? So in order to identify what needs to be qualified, it's important to understand what Azure is. So essentially, Azure is a public off-premise cloud computing platform which was created by Microsoft for building, deploying, and managing applications and services through a global network of Microsoft-managed data centers. It's administered by Microsoft's Global Foundation Services Group, which manages the core infrastructure and foundation technologies upon which Azure is delivered. And it's providing both PaaS and IaaS service delivery models. So IaaS is defined as infrastructure as a service, which allows customers to create virtual machines which they have complete control. So the customer doesn't manage or control the underlying cloud infrastructure, but they have control over the operating systems, any storage, or any deployed applications that sit on top of that virtualized, in this case, it's called a fabric. The PaaS services allow developers to build and deploy applications on the platform with programming languages and tools that are supported by the entire resource stack. So this diagram really depicts the different components that the IaaS and PaaS delivery models are comprised of, and who typically manages those components. The distribution in terms of the component management is key when considering how the platform should be qualified. So what is it exactly that we're qualifying? The cloud, essentially, the cloud infrastructure is composed of several components, which together form the platform on which the individual applications can be installed, as depicted in this diagram. So we see that we have the data center facilities, infrastructure hardware, network components, infrastructure and tools, and on top of that we have the applications. So in the context of IT infrastructure, qualification typically consists of demonstrating the ability of the components to fulfill the specific requirements of the various platforms. So in order to meet these requirements, we also have to take into consideration the controlled processes, the infrastructure processes that really govern the operation and maintenance of those components. So we have to ensure that we have ongoing quality management of these IT infrastructure processes so that we ensure all procedures are in place to control the lifecycle activities of all the IT infrastructure components. And we also have to ensure that qualified personnel are available to complete their assigned tasks. Now, in terms of validation, that consists of primarily demonstrating that user requirements are met. And as such, validation is performed by the regulated users of the GXP computerized systems that reside on the application. However, in order to qualify the system, we obviously need to consider those controlled applications, the controlled processes that are being managed by Microsoft. But later on in the presentation, we'll be looking at the specific elements that are typically verified as part of the IT infrastructure qualification effort. So taking into consideration the key concerns and the key attributes of the Azure environment, we put together the qualification guideline. Now, the purpose of the guideline is to assist life science customers in establishing a qualification strategy for the Azure platform. The target audience is any regulated customer within the life sciences industry that is aiming to use the Azure platform to host GXP regulated systems. The guidance was created based on the assumption that Microsoft's customers will be using Azure services really in the context of GXP regulated activities, and that in performing these activities, the customer would be generating or managing electronic records. So it's for this reason that the regulatory scope consists of the FDA 21 CFR Part 11 for electronic records, and the UDRALEX Volume 4 Annex 11 for computerized systems. Now, the scope was limited to these regulations as they generally apply to most IT systems which are used in the context of GXP applications. The subparts within 21 CFR Part 11 that relate to electronic signatures are out of scope because Microsoft does not provide an electronic signature functionality as part of the Azure platform. This is something that obviously could be added by the customer as part of their particular systems, but in this particular case, we're looking at the fundamental features that are provided and then the controls that need to be in place in order to be able to manage electronic records in a compliant manner. It should be noted that other regulations may be applicable when considering the specific regulated activity that is being managed by the GXP application. So we established several guideline objectives, and the first of which is to identify Microsoft's procedural and technical controls which govern the Azure platform services and that can be leveraged by the regulated user to demonstrate compliance with the applicable regulatory requirements. The second is to identify activities and controls that should be established by the customers, or the regulated user in this case, in order to qualify and maintain control over those GXP applications that are installed within the Azure platform. The next is to identify any key deliverables that should be produced as part of the qualification effort, and to identify the responsibilities shared by Microsoft and its customers for meeting the regulatory requirements. So in terms of Microsoft's responsibilities, they're essentially responsible for ensuring that the Azure platform is managed in a controlled and secured manner so as to provide the following key elements. So confidentiality, ensuring that information is accessible only to those authorized to have access to that information. Integrity, data integrity, essentially safeguarding the accuracy and completeness of information and any processing methods, as well as availability, where we need to ensure that authorized users have access to information and the associated assets whenever required. Next is that whenever a new virtual machine is deployed within the Azure platform, these machines are created using the default configuration established by Microsoft. And therefore, it's Microsoft's responsibility to ensure that virtual machines are deployed within the Azure fabric in a way that they meet the specifications. They're also responsible to ensure that the Azure service meets the terms defined within the governing service level agreements. So in order to meet these requirements, Microsoft has implemented several controls, both procedural and technical. The following is a list of Microsoft's controls which we identified as having an impact on regulatory requirements that are stipulated within either 21 CFR Part 11 or Annex 11. Now, these controls are audited on a yearly basis by independent auditors, as mentioned by Gabor, to verify the adequacy of Microsoft's internal processes against ISO and SSAE 16 auditing standards. So Montrium reviewed the following audit reports to ensure that the adequacy of the previously stipulated procedural and technical controls established at Microsoft. So the ISO 27001 audit specifies the requirements for implementing security controls surrounding information security management systems. The SOC 1 Type 2 or SSAE 16 audit report reported on the policies and procedures in operation and test of operating effectiveness for a certain period of time. And finally, the SOC 2 Type 2 audit focuses on controls at the service organization that are relevant to the following aspects: security, availability, processing integrity, and confidentiality. So the assessment that we performed showed that the audited controls within these audit reports are similar to those required to satisfy the applicable regulatory requirements that are in scope, so 21 CFR Part 11 and Annex 11. So therefore, we felt that the customer can leverage these audits as part of the risk analysis process and the qualification effort for their GXP application installed on the Azure platform. And these audit reports can be requested by Microsoft's customers for review under NDA. Now, in terms of the customer responsibilities, so the following is a high-level summary of the customer's responsibilities, which include evaluation of risks associated with using a cloud environment to host the GXP application, evaluating Microsoft's processes and controls in relation to those regulatory requirements that are specific based on the actual GXP application, to qualify any virtual machines and validate the GXP application that is deployed within the Azure platform, and also to establish procedures governing the operation and maintenance of the controlled environment. So in terms of the procedures, the following is a list of the internal procedures that should be established by the customers to ensure that the applications are operated and maintained in a controlled manner. So these procedures should be reviewed and updated as necessary to reflect any specific requirements when considering the use of the Azure platform as the foundation for the GXP application. So as part of the guideline, Montrium performed a detailed regulatory compliance assessment on each requirement in 21 CFR Part 11 and Annex 11 to interpret how compliance could be achieved and to map these to the specific controls which were audited by those independent auditors. The assessment described the specific responsibilities of the customer and in Microsoft, as well as the activities and documentation and controls that had to be put in place in order to meet the regulatory requirements. So the following is an example of an assessment that was done specifically for 21 CFR Part 11.10d, where the requirement is to limit system access to only authorized individuals. So in this example, we identified the responsibilities of the customer, which in this particular case revolve around security and user access management, which we've listed the specific activities that the customer should perform in relation to this. So ensuring that users are accessing the system in a controlled manner, that the administrator has control over access to the portal, and that we have documentation surrounding who has access to the system. We've also listed the responsibilities and the controls that Microsoft has put in place which have an impact on the ability to meet this requirement. In this case, the security policies and procedures, the controls surrounding physical security, as well as logical security. So we've done this for each of the regulatory requirements in 21 CFR Part 11 and Annex 11, which you can see within the guideline. And this can be used by the sponsors as a basis for their regulatory compliance assessment. The qualification approach that we're proposing is really based on ISP's good practice guides, namely GAMP5, risk-based approach to compliant GXP computerized systems, and the good practice guide for IT infrastructure control and compliance. We also leveraged the PICS guidance, which is the Pharmaceutical Inspectorate Collaboration Scheme. Basically, this guidance covers good practices for computerized systems in regulated GXP environments. So the following is an overview of the qualification process and the various phases. And the overall qualification process that we recommend that we follow is generally the same process that is described in the GAMP Good Practice Guide for IT Infrastructure and Control. The first phase of the process is planning, where we would prepare the qualification plan and identify any SOPs which need to be created or updated as a result of using Azure. The next stage of the process is the specification and design, where we would identify system requirements needed to support the GXP application and determine the appropriate server architecture and server specifications. The next stage is risk assessment and qualification test planning, where we would perform a hazard analysis to determine risks associated with hosting the GXP application in off-premise cloud, and define the scope of qualification, the test specifications, and the overall acceptance criteria. Next is the procurement, installation, and IQ phase. So procurement in this case is greatly simplified, seeing as the servers can be provisioned automatically on demand. However, the installation verification tests of the VM are still valid and need to be performed. We also, during this phase, will verify that the SLAs are in place. The OQ and acceptance phase is where we would perform operational and user acceptance testing to verify that the GXP applications are fit for their intended purpose. And finally, the last phase is the reporting and handover, where we would typically produce the summary reports, which summarize the results of the overall qualification process. So the following slide depicts elements that are typically verified as part of the IT infrastructure qualification. So we have different components of the IT infrastructure, which include the facility, where we verify things like environmental controls, humidity, temperature, power redundancy, physical security. And we have the network, where we can be verifying cabling, connectors, routers, switches, the network inventory, the topology configuration, and any specific configuration settings. And then the following phase, or this following grouping, is the servers, where we would verify the server specifications, the server inventory, and also key configuration settings. So in terms of the physical elements, Microsoft is responsible for implementing the controls which are governed by the procedures and policies which we'd already previously discussed. And in terms of the virtual elements, the customer is responsible for verifying these, which is something that is typically going to be done as part of the IQ verification. So the key items that are going to be verified as part of the IQ include the virtual machines, the deployment of the virtual machines and their configurations to ensure that they're meeting specifications, the network topology and server landscape diagrams to make sure that they are accurate. And we're also going to verify the minimum software and hardware, in this case the virtual hardware requirements for the GXP application, to ensure that they are met. So typically what we verify is the amount of memory, the disk space, the number of CPUs, the operating system, including any service packs, hot fixes, or security patches. We also verify any other software dependencies or service programs. So now I just want to talk about some specific considerations that should be observed when considering the use of Azure. So, essentially, we need to determine the appropriate system architecture, considering the scalability and performance needs. So in this, what we would like to consider are the availability sets and affinity groups, which are standard features of the Azure platform. So an availability set is essentially a grouping of servers in which we define the fact that we do not want those servers to ever be updated at the exact same time. Essentially, Microsoft does push certain updates to the Azure fabric in an automatic way that in some cases could impact a virtual machine and might require it to be restarted. So by grouping a virtual machine within an availability set, we assure that that virtual machine will never be updated at the exact same time as another. And therefore we can mitigate the risk in terms of availability. Affinity groups are mostly in relation to performance. So we create affinity groups where servers can be clustered together in close proximity. And so this is something that should be considered when determining performance requirements. The virtual machine deployment, it is possible to deploy virtual machines in an automated way within Azure using scripts, and this is something that should be considered as it could greatly reduce human error when deploying and configuring virtual machines. User access management needs to be controlled, obviously, with procedural controls to ensure that Microsoft IDs and passwords are being managed appropriately. Configuration management and change management must also be considered as virtual machines are deployed within the Azure platform. However, the configuration and changes of these virtual machines is still managed by the customers. Data backup and restoration. So we need to implement technical controls to manage the server and application level data backup. This is something that's not done by Microsoft. It's still the responsibility of the customer to ensure that the backups are being performed and that we're able to restore application data. Security monitoring is also something that is important to be considered and to put in place the appropriate measures to prevent external threats. Also to be considered is any requirements needed for data encryption. Next is the OS patching and automatic upgrading. So it is possible within Azure to automatically patch and update the underlying OS. And so we need to perform assessments to determine when that's appropriate, and that should be covered by procedural controls. And finally, incident management, where procedural controls for incident and alert reporting to Microsoft should be specified whenever the issues are related to systems within Azure. So finally, conclusions and recommendations. So the following slide is a summary of the recommended approach. So the first step is really to identify which regulations apply based on the intended use of the GXP application, and identify the controls needed to be able to achieve compliance. Next would be to review the independent audits to determine the acceptability of Microsoft's controls in relation to those regulatory needs. And then finally, map the individual controls to regulatory requirements in order to demonstrate compliance and identify responsibilities shared between Microsoft and the internal system owners. And the last is to develop the qualification plan and perform the verification activities. So in conclusion, there's significant value to be had from leveraging the cloud technology, considering the ability to rapidly deploy resources and scale them based on specific needs. It's important to define the clear qualification process for the organization, which will ensure that you collectively meet regulatory requirements. And this process should really document activities performed by Microsoft and the sponsor in the form of a compliance assessment. And finally, we need to reevaluate on a regular basis these controls as things evolve, and therefore we need to ensure that we have ongoing compliance. So thank you very much.